Hey, do you like survival games? Probably, because the numbers don't lie. These games are absolutely massive. With all their intricacies and subgenre breakouts, survival games are still going strong in 2024. So today we're rounding up 20 new and upcoming survival games for 2024. Let's get started off with number 20 and talk Terminator Survivors. Because if you ask me, this is just like a really good idea for a survival game. It feels like everybody's trying to attach IP to survival games. We'll talk about that in a minute, but with Terminator, it makes sense because this game is centered around just after Judgment Day, with humanity kind of pulling themselves out of the rubble and trying to make sense of what's going on in this new world ruled by machines. It's you alone or cooperatively with other people surviving, fighting the machines, scrounging for resources, building up bases, defending those bases, and just doing survival game stuff, but in the world of Terminator. This is published by Nacon, a publisher that has a track record of putting out a lot of stuff of all different levels of quality, I'd say. But with Terminator Resistance, all we really have so far at the time of making this video are some pretty good looking screenshots and a flashy cinematic pre-rendered trailer that doesn't really give us an actual glimpse of the game. Still, like I said, I think the idea itself is strong enough if they can actually execute it. You know, we're all building bases and we're all scrounging for resources in plenty of survival games, but if you're doing it to build up and fight back against Skynet's machines, like that's pretty cool. Hopefully we'll find out more about this one soon, but as of right now, it does have a release date slated for October 24th, 2024. Next, over at number 19, we have Abiotic Factor. This is a game by Deep Field Games, the people behind Unfortunate Spacemen, so if you like that kind of quirky alternative vibe, you might get that here. This is centered around survival crafting for 1 to 6 players, but it takes place entirely indoors. You're essentially locked in a massive underground research facility, and from here, you're building up, kind of like getting a little base for safekeeping, you're building up weapons, you're outfitting and equipping your character to defend against all kinds of threats. Soldiers, the fact that there's like this whole containment failure within the place, and there's like all kind of paranormal interdimensional stuff, so while it seems like you're just trapped in massive warehouses and facilities, it does go bigger than that, but it's kind of just like this weird survival spin on Half-Life 1. At least that's what I've kind of gathered from it. So far, it does seem like people are really digging it. On Steam, it released to the incredible, overwhelmingly positive, and that's heavy stuff. This released May 2nd in early access, but it does seem like people are really enjoying it just because it's got a little bit of quirk to it. It's got something a little different to it compared to your normal average survival game. Next, over at number 18, if you like survival games, but you're more into just adventure RPGs, Enshrouded might be the perfect hybrid for you. Picture a massive, massive voxel-based world where you're dumped in, you create your own character, you kind of build out your own class, engage in RPG systems, but then jump in cooperatively with other players to build, forage, survive, and venture through this world that gives you actual real bosses, quests, dungeons, and just good old-fashioned video game RPG stuff. You can play it with up to 16 players, and this game has a lot to it. A lot of ways to outfit your character, some really cool traversal stuff going on, and a main world and a sub-world, an actual shrouded world that you can dive into that's more dangerous, but nets deeper rewards. This released in early access earlier this year, like January, I believe, and it's been going strong so far. It definitely needs some work, but out of all the games on this list, this is probably one of the bigger, more bold, ambitious ones, and if you like the various words I threw out here, because it does check a lot of boxes, consider checking out Enshrouded. It is different. Next, over at number 17, we have Ark 2. I'm kind of including this one out of obligation. We don't know if we're actually going to see it this year, but we might get a good glimpse of it finally because it's been in the works for so long, and at this point we still know barely anything about it. But it is the follow-up to Ark Survival Evolved, one of the most massive, hugely popular survival games ever made. I expect them to really, really top themselves with this one. At least I hope they do, because the budget, the player base, everything, they really have the capability and the resources, I think, to hopefully push the genre forward once again. How will they do that? I don't know. All I know is that Vin Diesel is in the game. So there's that. As of right now, like I said, no release date for Ark 2, but hopefully we see more this year. Next over at number 16, we have Rooted. This is something that looks a little bit more like a traditional boots on the ground multiplayer survival game. It's you and your friends running around, scavenging, scrounging, crafting, building out, and surviving in this post-apocalyptic world, an abandoned world, overgrown, beautifully rendered in Unreal Engine 5. I will say that it looks gorgeous from what we've seen so far, and it's kind of doing what, like, I hate to say it, the day before that failed game was kind of attempting to do: apply multiplayer, co-op, and survival elements to something more of like The Last of Us aesthetically. Here you're running around scavenging for resources in an overgrown post-apocalyptic city, throwing stuff in your backpack, crafting out of your backpack, like with a little bit more realistic grit to it. But hopefully they can actually pull this off, because the concepts of The Last of Us applied to a survival game could be pretty cool. I don't know, as of right now, it's pretty simple. I will say what they've shown of the building and crafting for like your base, that does look very impressive, but I'm curious to see what else this thing is really cooking up. You can sign up for an alpha, and overall this game seems a bit more legit than something like the day before. I want to make sure I don't completely compare them like that was a scam. This seems like an actual good project in process, but we'll know for sure when we get our hands on it. As of right now, it doesn't have a release date, but like I said, alpha signups are a thing. Next over at number 15, we have Road to Vostok. This one is really cool just from the concept alone. Essentially, it's a survival game, but set in a kind of post-apocalyptic no man's land between the border of two countries. You're in this border zone and like you're doing survival game stuff. You're crafting, you're building, you're foraging, but you are trying to make your way across this border zone. And that just is a cool idea because it gives you some direction, some goals. But what we have here is actually like a very hardcore single player survival style game where like every bullet matters, resources are harsh, accuracy is important. And aside from being a hardcore survival game, it seems like it might actually end up being just like a good shooter. I like what I'm seeing here, and I hope they really nail this one. There is actually a demo out now if you want to check it out, and otherwise it is releasing in early access sometime soon. Next over at number 14, we have Nightingale. This is a kind of different aesthetic spin on the survival genre where you're hopping between different realms and fighting massive creatures and, of course, looting, crafting, building up, punching trees, doing all that survival game stuff. But the vibe, the aesthetic is a little different. The presentation here is all centered around gas lamp, so it's kind of like an 1800s style to it, but with like high fantasy elements. It's very, very cool on paper. Unfortunately, the game did release in early access February 20th, and it definitely needs some work. As of right now, it's not totally living up to its good premise. There's some balancing stuff, and like a lot of the early game stuff is a little less exciting, but we're really hoping Inflection Games can make this something great because, like I said, aesthetically, story, world building wise, it is very unique. If they can just figure out making some of those survival game elements a little bit more compelling, Nightingale could be the next big thing. As of right now, like I said, it is available in early access if you want to check it out. Next over at number 13, we have State of Decay 3. Now, State of Decay 2 was a survival game, but just kind of like very much its own thing. The way it worked with zombies and surviving and how the survivors and resources worked felt kind of unique. It was a really good spin on these genres. So we've been looking forward to State of Decay 3 since it was announced years ago. We haven't really heard much about this game, but I keep bringing it up because I really want to hear something soon. I'm thinking this is the year where we finally get a glimpse of what they've been working on at Undead Labs, and I really hope that they've spent all this time to make something great, because the potential for State of Decay has always been there. The game has had its fan base, but, you know, you can argue that they've also been pretty flawed. So State of Decay 3 could really knock things absolutely out of the park. Like I said, no release date yet, but I'm hoping we see something more this year. Now down at number 12, we have Frostpunk 2. This is a weird game because you look at it and you don't think it's a survival game. It looks more like an RTS, a city builder. Yes, that's technically what it is, a city builder through and through, but it has survival elements just because the game is harsh and brutal. You're constantly worrying about dwindling resources and keeping this civilization alive in a harsh climate. If it's anything like the first game, it was absolutely brutal and challenging. Every decision has multiple impacts, every consequence has an equal and opposite reaction, all that stuff, but just in really, really in-depth, challenging, and compelling ways. Resources are constantly dwindling, and you're constantly stressing out because you're trying to keep everybody alive. You know, you're not just mining ore and chopping down trees to help yourself survive, you're worrying about ruling a civilization and making the right decisions, and even some of the most blatantly good decisions still have negative consequences. So the first game was absolutely awesome for that, and I would chalk it up kind of as a survival game, and I'm gonna hope that Frostpunk 2 continues the trend. As of right now, Frostpunk 2 is releasing July 25th, 2024. Next, over at number 11, we have Once Human. This is a multiplayer open world survival game. The open world looks really impressive. It's like a post-apocalyptic future, but it's filled with some really interesting monsters, and the game is centered around seemingly tight, over-the-shoulder third-person shooting. I love a good third-person shooter. I love a good open-world third-person shooter. So what you're doing here is post-apocalyptic base building, crafting, scrounging for resources type things, but with your friends, while also shooting really cool monsters and some bosses that actually look pretty massive. You're building up your house, your base, you're also dealing with other factions out there and the world, and you're trying to get to the bottom of what ruined the world, this like magical stardust stuff from seemingly space that just screwed everything up. Seems really interesting. We hope it's cool. We don't know, but we're gonna check it out when it releases sometime in the third quarter of 2024. Next, over at number 10, we have V Rising. Now, this is cheating a little bit because this game has been out in early access for quite some time now, but just recently it finally got its 1.0 release. So now people are experiencing the full-fledged V Rising at 100% what it should be, what the developers intended, and it's absolutely awesome. I mean, we have been talking about it for years. It is a very different survival game. It's top-down, it's isometric, it's way more in-depth than you'd expect, and just is a really good spin on vampire stuff. By playing as a vampire, you're essentially trying to rebuild your vampire empire, rebuild your castle, you know, reclaim your power, and to do that, you need to adventure, loot, survive, do all that stuff, but not do it during the day because vampires can't be in the sun, obviously. It's just little quirks like that, attention to vampire detail that make V Rising really special. But you can play it alone or with friends. They did a really cool Castlevania collaboration, and at this point with 1.0, there's a lot of content here, so consider checking it out, especially if you just like vampire games. Next, over at number 9, here's a really interesting one called Aloft. This is essentially all centered around surviving on floating islands, but these islands you can kind of make into your own little airships. So instead of crafting and building up a little base just in the woods or on a mountain or something, you're doing it on an actual island floating in the sky. You can harness and essentially control these floating islands and live and survive on them. That's a really cool and unique premise. In the survival genre, there's always room for cool new ideas, and this one is absolutely awesome. You know, you're fighting back enemies that kind of like corrupt the ecosystem, but it's all really about farming, gliding around, building, and navigating the winds and the clouds and the weather and all that. You can actually glide around, you can build sails for your giant islands and start steering them like a giant pirate ship. This one just has a lot of good, unique ideas to it. It's from Astrolabe Interactive, the people who previously made Sacrifice Your Friends, and this is an early access game. It also has a demo available on Steam if you're looking to check that out, and as of right now, Aloft has a release date just scheduled as tentatively 2024. I'm definitely keeping my eye on this one as kind of a change of pace. I think we all need that once in a while. Next, over at number 8, we have The Altars. This is completely different, and I'll be honest, it's one that's difficult to describe. It is a game where you're surviving, but it's really a lot about base building. Essentially what it is a very, very science fiction-y, single-player, third-person adventure, where you're like a lone man, just like a worker guy stranded on a remote planet, and it's up to you to build up and manage this kind of base space station that can move around the planet, because when the sun rises on the this planet, those rays are actually deadly, so you're kind of constantly in flux. The game also apparently takes into account the planet's own actual cycle and how that reflects like the resources you're going to get and like what is available to you to keep your base and your character alive. With that, the developers have talked about different decisions that you make and kind of like a spin on time travel where you're making choices in the past to quote save yourself in the present, like you're making new versions of yourself. It's really trippy. It's a lot to describe, like I said, and there's like, you know, third person base management inside, but you're also suiting up and venturing out on this planet. It seems incredibly ambitious. It's from 11-Bit Studios, the publisher behind so many interesting, weird, creative games like Indica most recently, but also The Invincible, South of the Circle, This War of Mine, Frostpunk. The Alters is definitely something worth keeping an eye on, let's just say that. Now, next over at number 7, we have Light No Fire. This is the newest game from Hello Games, the people behind No Man's Sky. Now, of course, No Man's Sky released and it was pretty rough at first, but they put their money where their mouth was and they made an awesome game out of that. So, alongside consistently updating that game and making it kick ass for years, they've apparently also been working on this thing, Light No Fire, which is kind of like an MMO, massively multiplayer, procedurally generated, but truly actual open world. They say it is the first open world game because it is an actual real full planet. With this planet, it looks like there's like different biomes, different cultures and stuff to engage in as you fly around and get into adventures and hijinks either with friends or alone. But there's something about it that's a little bit more lo-fi, a little more chill and artsy. I don't know, it's hard to explain and we don't know too much about it yet, but the project does seem like it's pretty far along. I really think that Hello Games has come a long way since the launch of No Man's Sky, and I'm gonna be completely honest, I am really excited to see what they've been cooking up with this one. Next over at number 6, if you're looking for something a little bit more medieval, a little bit more sword and shield, we have Bellwright. Essentially, you play as somebody that was blackmailed for the murder of a prince, and it's up to you to lead your homeland to stage a rebellion against the brutal ruling regime. And you're doing that by doing survival stuff. You're building up a village, you're making your settlement stronger and stronger, you're helping out villagers, you're building things up, but you're also going out there and fighting battles. You're engaging in first-person combat, and it seems like a good mix of stuff. It's still very much a work in progress. It did release in early access in April to mostly positive results on Steam. So if you're into stuff like Manor Lords and kind of like that top-down village building, but you want more survival elements and you want to be on the ground level, consider Bellwright. Next over at number 5, we have something a little different once again. It's Into the Dead, Our Darkest Days. You may have seen this one. It did make a splash when it was first revealed because it's kind of like a third-person zombie survival adventure on a two-dimensional plane. It's 1980 in a Texas town recently taken over by zombies, and this is a shelter-based survival game. So you're going out there, you're creeping around, you're engaging in stealth and using limited weaponry to get the drop on zombies, survive, but get resources to bring them back to safety to continue to survive. Getting resources and really building up and upgrading your shelters is all about protecting survivors. You want these shelters to house your survivors and keep them safe. And as you keep moving forward in the game and establishing settlements, the zombie outbreak gets worse and worse, making places that were previously pretty easy to go through much more difficult. There's also the human element, of course, because not only are you trying to build safety for survivors, but some of them, you can choose to trick them out of supplies, kill them, or convince them to stay with you. And even then, you still have to worry about their psychological needs. So it's a lot of survivor management, kind of like a State of Decay, but in a really cool presentation and a totally different style of gameplay. Into the Dead just seems really unique from the gameplay setting to the actual gameplay perspective and everything really going on here, and we're excited to see more. We're hoping we hear more this year. Next over at number 4, we have Outward 2. Outward really set the stage for challenging open world survival games where resources are brutally difficult to manage, enemy encounters are tense, and they're also really fun to play with friends. The developers took that energy into Outward 2, which they're now working on. They've apparently been working on it for a bit, but unfortunately we don't know when it's releasing quite yet. But if it's anything like the first one, it is just a strong RPG with very intense survival elements that, focus on a little bit of realism while still being fantasy. It's a really good mix. mechanics with just loads and loads to do, and just judging from what the developers have said about the new one, it seems like there's going to be even more to take on. We're hoping we get an update for it this year, but as of right now, we don't know, but we will keep you guys updated. Now down at number 3, we have Pacific Drive. This is that sci-fi car driving game that released a few months back that you might not realize is kind of a survival game. It's all run-based. You're hopping into this old jalopy car and driving out into a world ridden by weird scientific anomalies, trying to get proper parts and stuff to then bring back to your home base garage and build up your car and make it stronger to resist more elements, radiation, electrical storms, just crashing into things. Whereas you start the game with a very, very slow vehicle that can't resist any scientific anomalies, and you're gonna get flat tires all the time. Eventually, you're gonna have a way more powerful car that is better at fuel consumption, has armored panels, and has a bunch of Ghostbusters tech on it to survive the harsh elements. There's a really cool layer of progression here that is just so satisfying, and the game is just incredibly unique. Out of all the games on this list, this is one of the more interesting ones. It's difficult to describe, but really, really satisfying to play. When you get through a run with all the stuff you threw in your trunk, it just feels really good, man. We have talked about Pacific Drive a lot already in the past. If you do want to check out my Before You Buy video, check that out where we go more in depth, but Pacific Drive is absolutely a survival game worth considering. If you're sick and tired of just endlessly chopping down trees and you want something a bit different, this is your game. Now down at number 2, we have Dune Awakening. This is from the people behind Conan Exiles, who have some experience in this type of thing, but now they're taking on Arrakis. This is of course based on the classic sci-fi novel, and if you ask me, the world of Arrakis and spice and different cultures really lends itself to a survival game. I think they can really do something with this. We've finally just gotten some glimpses of gameplay that does make it look pretty cool, but it's still hard to tell because we have only seen so much, but we're really excited at the prospects of a proper Dune game where you're just trying to survive on this harsh desert planet where moisture and water is a very, very precious commodity. And we're curious to see how they can, get that across in gameplay elements. The potential is there. Dune is just cool, good old-fashioned, awesome sci-fi. And we're excited to see what Funcom has been cooking up with this one. Apparently it's going to get a release date soon, and we're hoping it's sooner rather than later. But now down at number 1, we have Pal World, the game that took the world by storm earlier this year. It's Pokemon with guns. That's what everybody's been calling it, but to be fair, it's way more than that. It's actually a survival game, first and foremost, that also happens to have Pokemon and also happens to have guns. And it is still very much a work in progress game. It's an early access game. There's only so much you can do with it, and it's pretty janky in spots. It definitely has a long road in front of it, but we think it's got the legs because so many people have jumped in. We're excited to see the developers really double down on making good on the promise here, because the survival elements with some fine tuning can be pretty cool, and it just makes sense for a Pokemon style game where it's way more interesting to harvest resources and build up a base when you're capturing Pokemon that can help you out with that. So if you're one of the few people that haven't checked out Pal World at this point, definitely consider it now.